Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
Education Corner podcast is thrilled to welcome Professor John Mullan, who is head of the Department of English at UCL. It's a pleasure to have you with us, John. To begin, as the head of the English department, which was one of the first to offer English literature as a course, can you tell us a little bit more about how this came to be?
I think the funny thing is that probably lots of people now tend to assume that English literature has always been something studied at universities and schools, but it's not so. I mean, it's a relatively modern invention by my standards anyway. So even when UCL was founded in the 1820s, it was very unusual in that there was a professor of English literature and he gave lectures on literary topics, but you couldn't do a degree in English in those days. And you could go to lectures on great authors as part of your general background education. But in fact, it wasn't right until the end of the 19th century that UCL offered what we would call an English degree. And even though it was at the late 19th century, UCL was being rather go ahead in doing that. So, for instance, Cambridge, which became rather the home of English studies in the middle of the 20th century, didn't offer an English degree till the 1920s. And most other universities in Britain, it's a sort of 20th century subject. So it's a sort of funny thing. It became English literature a thing to study in schools in the 19th century, especially for sort of young men who were going to go off and work in the civil service or run the empire, and who perhaps came from backgrounds too modest to allow them to do the traditional subjects of Latin and Greek. But it only became a university subject really in the 20th century. And in doing so, it sort of knocked to one side those traditional literary subjects of the classics, really. It's relatively recent import to the higher education world.
You know, that's a complete shock to me. I truly would have believed it was one of the first degrees. Why do you think it's important then, going from that, for students to study English language and English literature? And certainly, obviously, you're head of the department at UCL. What is it you'd be hoping that they'd take away from the degree?
Well, it's funny with English, one gets so used to sort of having to justify it as a subject. And I think one of the slightly melancholy aspects of my job is that that's become more so in recent years, it seems. And students sometimes tell me that even their parents have to be persuaded that it's worth doing. So, I mean, I'm used to do it in terms of what the sort of skills students take away. And I think that that's a possible way of explaining what the point of doing English as a subject is. It teaches people to think, not just clearly, but also in a way vividly, because they're thinking through some really sort of intelligent and imaginative writers from the past, often, whom they're reading. It teaches you to read attentively and critically. And goodness knows, I think, our graduates, quite often when they come back and talk to our students about their experiences in the workplace, will tell them that actually the ability to read in a kind of forensic and analytical way is very rare in the world. Yes. And of course, above all, perhaps the ability to write lucidly and expressively, which is also, I think, a rare skill. And in some ways, even more important in an age where people kind of believe that you can teach computers to do that rather than human beings to do that. But those are all justifications in terms of what English graduates have to take into the workplace. And in some ways, that's getting it back to front, because, of course, the great thing about English is that it's a subject, I think, that usually students love doing. It's so often the case that if you listen to somebody's account of how they first discovered, in some ways, the joys of education, of learning things, it will often be through their discovery of the pleasures of reading when they're young. 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, that means the pleasure of reading fiction, usually, maybe sometimes poetry or something as well, but usually it means novels. And actually, very often people who will end up not necessarily even doing English at university first discover the excitement of learning things for themselves through reading fiction. And it takes you out of yourself, doesn't it? It allows yourself to imagine other lives in a way that no other reading experience does. And it also introduces you, crucially, I think, to the subtleties and the potential of language and how it's best being used. And language, that's where we live. We live in language, and literature is a sort of introduction to language at its greatest stretch, as it were. So I hope that the students at the end of their degree at UCL take away not just, I hope, intellectual self-confidence, the ability to speak and think for themselves, not just a kind of critical skepticism, the ability to read or listen to what others say and analyze it, but also actually, I hope they go away with literature in their head, with shards of what has best been expressed, even, I tell them, with quotations in their head. Because when you read somebody who writes well, or where you listen to somebody who speaks well in the English language, it's invariably full of what they've actually learned from reading, from literature.
I couldn't agree more. Many of the texts that you teach on the English literature course at UCL haven't changed for many years. Some are very popular amongst the students, others perhaps less so. What do you consider when you think about which texts should and should not be taught?
The question of what we set on our syllabuses really is a really interesting one. And to some extent, I think we're in a negotiation with students a lot of the time about that, in a way that teachers at A-level perhaps are not. I mean, they have perhaps their examining board gives them some options, but we are constantly listening to and talking to our students about what we might be expecting them to study. On the other hand, it's not just, I think, a matter of our or the students' tastes or opinions. If it were, we'd be constantly changing things all the time. You know, literature, the way we teach it in any way at UCL, is as, to some extent, a sort of historical subject. I mean, books are made out of other books. So, you know, it would seem very strange to most leading writers of the 20th century, say, it would seem most strange to poets of the 20th century if you thought you could understand what English poetry was without ever having, say, read Paradise Lost. You could say Paradise Lost is long and difficult and demanding, and it's written in a kind of English which actually seemed pretty strange to people in the 17th century and is not immediately accessible to readers now. But how can you understand Wordsworth or Christina Rossetti or T.S. Eliot without having read Paradise Lost? Because sure as hell they did. So the thing about English literature as a subject is that it's not just that there is something called the canon of great texts because university teachers say that there is. There is a sort of canon, open all the time to change and debate, but there is a sort of canon because writers decide it. Because if you read even, you know, contemporary English fiction and you've never read a Jane Austen novel, you're going to miss stuff. I can tell you, you know, Sally Rooney's obsessed with Jane Austen. I mean, that's the way that literature is. So we'd be doing our students a real disservice if we didn't help them to find their way through the allusions and borrowings and rewritings and endless reuse of the richest literary texts of the past by later writers. And so in our negotiations with students, we're also sometimes telling them, look, we think it's really important you read Chaucer, because for centuries, English poets thought that Chaucer was where English poetry sort of starts from. So all our second year students have to study some Chaucer. There are plenty of university courses where you wouldn't have to do that, but I think we make no apology for saying that we take decisions like that in order to give those who are studying English a sort of more realistic appreciation of how later literary texts are created.
And most recently, you published a book about Charles Dickens, The Artful Dickens. It was in 2020. Can you tell us a little bit about this? And do you feel that Charles Dickens was a social progressive?
Well, I wrote my book about Charles Dickens because I think he's a wonderfully inventive, audacious, and above all, maybe terribly funny writer. And because ever since he first burst onto the scene in the 1830s, became an almost overnight sensation, he has been, I think, looked down upon by critics and other writers as a sort of mere entertainer. You can't gainsay the fact that he is entertaining, and his contemporaries couldn't gainsay the fact that he was the most popular writer in the world, actually, in the mid-19th century, bar none. But that very popularity and the very fact that he was entertaining and funny was often thought of as a reason for condescending to him. He wasn't taken seriously as a literary innovator. And I think that's been the habit sometimes of critics and readers in the 20th and 21st century. So I wanted to sort of show how artful he was. That's why the title, obviously, it's a joke about the Artful Dodger. It's also, it has a point, which is to show his and take pleasure in his literary skill. And I suppose I should say that although, you know, he was a writer who I think did electrify sometimes the consciences of his Victorian readers and can still do that to readers, I don't think we read him because he's a political or moral sage. You know, I think we read him because open any Dickens novel at any page randomly, and the sentences are fizzing on the page. The characterizations and the voices of the characters are just immediately alive to you. Dickens very much liked to think of himself as a sort of moral and political sage, but I think often his lessons are quite simple ones compared to, I don't know, a novelist like George Eliot, whom I think you can go to for sort of instruction and wisdom about the world. So I don't want to put aside Dickens's achievements, I don't know, in Nicholas Nickleby alerting his contemporaries to the sort of scandal of these Yorkshire schools where children whose parents found them encumbrances were packed off to wither or even indeed to die. I don't want to diminish his ability to say to readers, look at this. This is what's happening in the world around you. But I don't think that's why I read Dickens, and it's certainly not why I wrote the book about him.
In 2012, you published a book on Jane Austen, What Matters in Jane Austen. Why do you think Jane Austen is still so popular among students to this day?
Well, Jane Austen, she's an extraordinary writer, isn't she? I think that the main reason that Jane Austen is so popular with readers, but particularly with students, is that she is so good at crediting the intelligence of her readers. It's a delight to study or to teach Jane Austen, because as soon as you start looking at what's going on in a chapter, on a page, in a paragraph, you start seeing all the tiny wheels that are spinning round. And I think she shares with Shakespeare this extraordinary ability to make minute connections between everything that's going on, in her case, a novel, in his case, a play, so that I think lots of people have this experience. I have read some Jane Austen novels 15 times or more in my life, but I know that if I sit down with, say, Emma, with a class of undergraduates, some of whom will have just have read it for the very first time, as soon as you start looking closely at particular episodes in the novel, undergraduates will start pointing out to each other, but also to me, things I'd never seen before. And she's extraordinarily rewarding like that. So there's nothing inert, there's nothing bland ever in any sentence, in any word any character says. She said herself, she said rather little about what she wrote and why she wrote, but she said to her sister once in a letter, I write not for such dull elves as have not a great deal of ingenuity themselves. And she activates our ingenuity, doesn't she? She makes us, while we're reading, if we want to be, as kind of clever and witty and perceptive as her. But then, unfortunately, we have to go back to life afterwards and rely only on our own faculties.
I don't think I could read those books enough. Do you have any advice for students who wish to study English literature at university? Is there anything that you feel they should be thinking about or considering?
Well, I suppose the best advice one could give is what the narrator of Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy says, rather admonishingly. Read, 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 my unlearned reader, read. When we are trying to choose from applicants to come to my department to study English, more important than anything else is some evidence that the person has got an appetite for reading, that they don't just read what they need to get A's in class or in exams. And almost, it doesn't matter what, almost. And I know that when I was in my teens, perhaps luckily for me, I had an incredibly boring time as a teenager. I lived in the countryside. I had nothing to do in the school holidays. And in those days, no internet, no daytime television to speak of. So I sort of read because it was my escape into a more interesting world. And I realize now, looking back, I probably read in slightly random ways, my choices of what to read. And I think that's fine. There isn't a sort of list that you have to tick off, although I think it's better to read well-written things than badly written things. But an appetite for reading is the most important thing, and it sort of feeds itself, doesn't it? There are, I think, people who apply to do English at university, and perhaps even people who end up doing English at university, who don't necessarily like reading that much. And I think that they've probably chosen the wrong subject if that's the case.
Going from that, it's an ongoing topic. It probably feeds then from that into the whole AI issue and the chat GPT. But audiobooks, the internet, it's a very changing scene. I went to UCL. We used to have to go to the library and find the book. And if someone had taken the book, we had to wait. It's now so much is online, so much is kind of virtual. How do you feel that's perhaps advancing the course, giving access perhaps to more people?
Well, maybe I can answer it in two parts. I think the audiobooks and the rise of audiobooks is a particular and interesting thing because, of course, oddly, in some ways it replicates what was many people's most common experience of literature until maybe the early 20th century. So, in Jane Austen novels, when the characters read, they most often read aloud to each other. That's what Catherine Morland and Isabella Thorpe do in Northanger Abbey. They're obsessed with Gothic novels. And they read these novels to each other. That's what happens when the ghastly Mr. Collins turns up in Pride and Prejudice. Because he's a vicar, as Jane Austen's own father was, of course, it's supposed that he has skills in reading aloud. And he's asked if he'll read aloud of an evening, because that's the usual form of entertainment. And he says yes, but then he refuses to read a novel. He has to read a conduct book instead, to everybody's horror, particularly Lydia's. What is one of Fanny Price's main jobs in Mansfield Park, where she has to tend on the sort of supine Lady Bertram? She reads to her. She reads Shakespeare, actually, to her. People are always reading aloud in Austen's novels because in the 19th century, that's what people did. The experience of listening to a book read aloud was taken for granted. That's how Dickens was read in families. People read the latest serial installment aloud. In some ways, our present passion for audiobooks, you could say, is a kind of return to that. And I'm rather a fan of audiobooks, and I think it'd be wrong to be snobbish about them. My only hesitation is, and I won't name names here, but I listen to audiobooks sometimes, perhaps like lots of people, particularly in the car. And sometimes I have to stop because I think it's just being read wrong. It's just being, or badly. And I think that there are great differences between how well audiobooks are or aren't read. I don't think you'd have wanted to listen to Mr. Collins read you anything, even a novel, would you? And I have had experiences of listening to audiobooks, I would say, badly or unskillfully read, but also the reverse. And anybody who's heard Juliet Stevenson read not just Jane Austen or George Eliot, but actually much more difficult late Henry James novels and managed to make sense of them to the listening ear will know that audiobooks can be wonderful. The internet, can I say something about the internet?
Well, yeah, it's a mixed bag. And obviously we support families, younger children, older children. We support families right the way through to their university applications. And there's a lot of resistance to even audiobooks, obviously not having a physical book in your hand, etc., etc. But obviously, to some level, we're all having to accept that if you've got dyslexia or all those different things, they can help facilitate access to the books that they may not have had previously. But go on, talk to me about the internet.
Well, I think for students of English anyway, the internet brings lots of really helpful possibilities, as it does to me. You can find out things very rapidly, which once took a long time to find out. The internet's fantastic for information, for names, dates, all sorts of basic facts. And also it's great for getting access to texts and for being able to search texts. Once upon a time, if I said to people, oh, Mr. Darcy smiles 8 times in Pride and Prejudice, and every time but once it is because of something Elizabeth has said. Once upon a time, that would have been an amazingly brilliant insight. But now, anybody who does a bit of word searching and who knows the book already can come up with that sort of insight, if insight it is. So, of course, the internet's really, really useful. I mean, there are 2 obvious downsides to it when you're teaching students. One is that students will sometimes believe too readily anything they find on the internet. So instead of relying on their own resources, their own intellectual and imaginative resources, they will try to find answers to questions they've been asked on the internet. And when you start searching, you'll just find any old thing. And one of the things that we try very hard to teach our students is where to go to look for critical accounts or insights, for instance, about a particular text. And we also teach them that even the texts themselves, the literary texts themselves that they might find, are sometimes not reliable. If you're studying Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, probably the first English novel, if you go onto the internet to read it, you'll find a version which has been completely repunctuated by some anonymous editor to conform to modern standards. It's not what Defoe wrote. But I think the second thing to say, which is a really important thing in the experience of discussing literature in a sort of seminar room, is actually not just the internet, but the laptop. I think the laptop can be a foe as well as a friend. Obviously, particularly sometimes students with special needs need laptops maybe all the time in the classroom. But as much as possible, we try to encourage students to close the lid, look up, because otherwise you can be in a room where there are 20 people hiding behind a laptop, and it's impossible to have a proper discussion, conversation, argument if people are doing that. It's okay in lectures, but in anything which involves discussion, I have a bit of a horror of the student, head down, tappy, tap, 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 tap. No, please, stop tapping, close the lid, let's talk about this. And I think that that's a really important thing.
In my day, we handwrote all our essays.
Yes.
Scary stuff. Going back slightly, I suppose it is interlinked, really. We know that obviously in this edition of the magazine, we're looking at AI, which is obviously something that everyone's talking about now. They believe that the first person's graduated through AI now, etc., etc. And at the UCL Institute of Education, you had Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, very recently, only last week, I think. Just how do you feel as a university, UCL, and certainly obviously with the English department, are preparing for this emergence of AI in education and how it's going to affect both yourselves and the students?
I think AI is going to have a really different impact in different subject areas. And many of my colleagues in other subjects in my university are quite sort of enthusiastic about how AI can be something students can be taught to use and that they as academics can also use. I think if you are in English literature like me, you probably have a less optimistic view of it. I mean, I can see that AI is going to become part of all our lives, and we're all going to need to understand it and how it's used. But it's difficult at the moment to believe that the uses of AI, which our students at English are most aware of, are ones we want to embrace. I mean, to be blunt, we want to teach students to be able to hold stuff in their head, particularly books or poems or plays, to be able to open them in their heads, to be able to remember bits of them and how they work, and then to be able to write about them. Strangely enough, one of the consequences, I think, of the rapid rise of AI, quite an unexpected one in my neck of the woods, will be probably going back to desk exams, because the COVID pandemic brought not just remote teaching, which we've now mostly got away from, but remote examining, online examining, which we haven't got away from. And universities love online exams. They're so much cheaper and easier, sort of hassle-free, although I think it often passes the task of things like invigilation from universities who should be doing it to parents who shouldn't. And so most universities have stuck with online assessment. But I think AI is rapidly making that unsustainable. And I think we will soon be going back in the humanities anyway to lots of sit-down, unseen exams. And personally, I think that's a good thing, actually. And I think it's fairer to the students as well, because, of course, remote online assessments, what students do in English, I think, is they sort of pre-prepare stuff, almost like chunks of material, and then try and fit it to what they're asked. And that means they do worse because, as I'm sure anybody listening to this will know, the great sin if you're doing an exam question for English is not answering the question. And the temptations in online assessments to not answering the question are huge because you've got every chance to sort of have it all ready to dump, as it were. And I think universities were very unwilling to go back to desk examination until AI came along. And I think things are changing really rapidly in that respect. So, you know, most of my colleagues at the moment would see the aspect of AI as AI writing stuff as the enemy, really, and something we must discourage our students from using.
Absolutely. Final question. The UCL English department, I could list them off as friends of mine have over the years, but well known producing some very successful and famous scriptwriters and producers, and obviously including Chris Nolan. Why do you think students have gone on to do so well, and, you know, quite a few into film production and scriptwriting?
That's such an interesting question. I know Christopher Nolan slightly and actually talked to him about exactly this question, you know, what he'd learned from the perhaps to some eyes rather traditional English literature course that we teach that had gone into his filmmaking career. I'm not sure if my answer to that was the same as his, but perhaps I can give an example which will illustrate what I think somebody studying the kind of course we do can learn. In their first year, all our students have to study a course called narrative text, which consists of a sort of sequence in chronological order, oldest to the most recent, of great works of literature, all of which tell stories, but in very different forms and genres. So some of them are poems like Paradise Lost or Wordsworth's The Prelude. Some of them are novels like The Mill on the Floss or Toni Morrison's Beloved. Some of them are satires like Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock. Some of the poems rhyme, some of the poems don't. And the students, I hope, learn, and those of us who teach the course learn, the different ways in which narratives can be structured. So how stories often don't start from the beginning, but start from the end and go backwards. How narrators like Milton or George Eliot employ extraordinary time shifts or shifts of perspective. Now, if you see Christopher Nolan films, to me, it often looks as though he's learnt it all from narrative texts. I mean, his films are all about extraordinary flashbacks and flash forwards. They all do extraordinary things with time, narrative time. So you never start at the beginning and work your way through to the end. You invariably start at the end and work your way back to the beginning. And you sometimes have some of the same bits of a story shown you more than once from different perspectives. And these are all, if you like, bits of narrative trickery that writers discovered before filmmaking or TV filmmaking ever existed. It's no accident, I think, that TV and film, actually Hollywood in particular, so indefatigably keeps returning to literature for its stories, just hungrily and tirelessly. And it's not just because of the funny costumes or the quaint manners of the past. It's also because some of the richest sort of narrative trickery is developed by literature before film and TV ever gets hold of it. And I think that's true of Christopher Nolan too.
What a wonderful answer. I wish I could go back and join in some of the lectures myself. I can't thank you enough. I know you're a very busy man, John, and thank you for contributing to our podcast.
Well, thanks very much for having such tricky but interesting questions for me.